The horrors of the U.S.-led war in Afghanistan continues to make news even after the U.S.'s disastrous pullout. The report has revealed that unarmed Afghan men were routinely shot by UK's elite forces during nighttime raids during this long war, and weapons were planted on them to justify their crimes. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at why there has not been an apology from the UK government, even though it has a lame duck prime minister, and we also examine whether this behavior is part of the protocol of UK's army in how it conducts itself on the battlefield.
In a damning report, BBC has revealed that British Special Air Service SAS unlawfully killed 54 civilians in the Afghan province of Helmand from 2010 to 2011. The report reveals that senior British officers, including the head of UK Special Forces, were aware of the crimes, but did not report them to military police.
Afghanistan had been the best backyard of the West during past decades. They committed any war crimes they could and violated every rule. Our country was used as the best scene of examining arms and training armies. All NATO forces, including Britain's, were largely involved in scandals. This as they were not being held accountable by any courts. I hope BBC's new report is not a media game only, and it will be followed by a judicial process.
The victims of the 20-year war and Afghan advocates are demanding compensation and accountability for their losses.
There
are a lot of helpless women and children in Afghanistan whose lives were devastated as a result of the US and allies' war crimes in our country. Some have lost their fathers and some their breadwinners. Today, they are left on the streets without food or shelter. We urge the UN and those institutions who claim to be the human rights champions to hold the international criminal accountable and help suffering families with compensation.
Previously, dozens of reports were published revealing the scandals and killings by other NATO troops, including American and Australian forces. In total, more than 46,000 Afghan civilians were killed from 2001 to 2021. Afghans are angry over NATO's 2 decades of destruction in their country. They are also calling for justice for hundreds of civilians who were killed by the US-led coalition's forces during their presence in Afghanistan. Reporting for Press TV, Rahmatullah Baghban, Kabul.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Scott Bennett joins us. He's a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer who joins us from San Francisco. Also joining us is Vladimir Goldstein, Associate Professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University in Rhode Island. Welcome to you both. Scott Bennett, first to you. What are your thoughts on SAS operatives in Afghanistan repeatedly, from what we understand of this report, killing detainees and unarmed men? It was reported it was in suspicious circumstances, and this was an investigation that was led by the government-funded channel, the BBC of the UK.
Well, the entire Afghan theater, the entire Afghanistan war was a war crime, is a war crime, and should be prosecuted as a war crime. The American people, the British people, the world, in fact, were lied to in this artificially generated false flag attack on 9/11 that was pre-planned. And the reason that Afghanistan was invaded was because of the opium poppy fields that the CIA had been trafficking in for over 30 years. And the rare earth minerals that Britain and the New World Order and the United States wanted to rape and pillage and harvest. So that was the real purpose for invading Afghanistan, not because any silly notions of terrorism. All of that was a fraud. Tim Osman, the former CIA operative, also known as Osama bin Laden, was revealed as the excuse, but that was quickly revealed as a fraud. So the entire Afghanistan operation was a fraud, but the particular aspects of the murders, the assassinations, the cold-blooded killing of the SAS services, which are the equivalent of the U.S. Special Forces services, that is part and parcel of what the U.S. and the UK military do. It's tragic that the military were, of course, lied to and told all of these horrendous, nightmarish stories of propaganda that fueled their animosity and their aggression, that no doubt the soldiers were completely lied to by many politicians, many cabinet members, many
Mhm.
senior officers. So they certainly should prosecute the high level officers and politicians that have presented this propaganda that goaded and animated these soldiers to do these crimes. And it should be investigated. And it's funny and tragic at the same time that the only moral military example that you can see in the modern world is Russia, that went into Ukraine to alleviate the rape and pillage of the Eastern Ukrainian people, the Eastern Russian people. The
Uh-huh.
Russian military stepped in to save them. And the Russian military has not been doing any of these war crimes, any of these murders in the military in the middle of the night, any
Sure.
of these destruction of civilian facilities.
Well, Vladimir Goldstein, just one of the units, as it was reported there, and I emphasize the word just one, said that they were responsible for the killing of 54 people during a 6-month tour, okay? Now you have this occurring, and you have SAS troops that at the same time have planted weapons, I guess, on them to justify the crimes. How can it be then that if they have done this, I'm sure other officers or compatriots or their fellow, I guess, officers were aware of what was going on? Why didn't this piece of news then spread and make it out in the open in order for there to be some kind of first highlight and then a follow-through investigation in order for there to be accountability at the end?
Well, we're dealing clearly with a sort of double standard. When every absolutely unproven crime, unproven event is always blamed on particular groups of people who are demonized, be it Russia, be it Iran, be it Chinese. These are the guys who do all the crimes according to Western media. They commit all the atrocities. They inhumane. They bomb the cities. They bomb indiscriminately, as opposed to the Western, soldiers who behave like, holier than thou. This is obviously a lie, but this lie is being repeated again and again and again. We know, like, from the way Americans behaved in Vietnam, when they would destroy the villages and claiming that they are trying to save them. I don't think anybody is above a reproach. War is war. War is an ugly thing. And, a lot of soldiers probably lose their cool. Of course, what's important to stress is special forces are supposed to be cooler than others. And they, of all people, they are not just regular soldiers who were told some stories and go on rampage. They should know better. So this is absolutely unacceptable. And Great Britain shouldn't sit on it. But the bigger picture is that Great Britain shouldn't go around the world pointing to other countries' crimes when they themselves are very actively involved. Just the other day, I read in BBC, Ukraine counted 21,000 war crimes committed by Russia. So, BBC already counting Russian crimes, while, it took them 10 or 12 years to figure out this one, which was staring straight at their face. And this is just totally kind of discouraging, basically, what an average person should think about this wars, when one side is always lying and always blaming another one.
Well, Scott Bennett, you have a senior officer, and he's given testimonials on this. First, he said that too many people were being killed, and he said that shouldn't happen when people are detained. Within the context of this report of this officer testifying, it really wasn't a testimonial. He was just making comments on this. He said that also within that report, he didn't say there was a line or two on how the bullets, in terms of the way that they went into the body, showed that the Afghans who were detained were on their knees. They were lower in their height than the person standing. And then the same UK officer saying for it to happen over and over again was causing alarm at HQ. Now, I'm guessing HQ means headquarters, and I'm guessing that means what? Headquarters in London or headquarters at the Army barracks? Because then that shows that the higher echelons of this were aware of this. So what happens once they're aware of this, these crimes being committed?
Well, that's exactly right. This is the indication and the proof and the evidence of a bloodthirsty murder squad. It is not special forces that are liberating oppressed people and lifting up those liberated people to pursue happy, healthy, productive lives. This is a murder squad. This is a military indoctrinated agenda to go in and commit the exact executions that the Ukrainians, by the way, were doing to Russian prisoners of war. These people, that the UK troops, and I might add also the United States troops, have done this before, where they by the trajectory of the bullet is forensically determined that the person was executed while in custody on the ground or on their knees. We've seen also American soldiers being executed by our own corrupt soldiers because they were getting in the way of the military-industrial complex, and that really is a big part of what fuels a lot of this. The military-industrial complex. So all of this needs to be brought up at an international level. All of it can never be forgotten, and it's also a sign of why Britain, in particular, and why Boris Johnson was thrown out of office. But Britain, in particular, and its military and the West, is so obsessed with trying to shift the world's attention off of their crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as Syria, as well as Libya, as Yemen. They're trying to shift it to Ukraine and create a new bad guy. But the world is seeing all of the 20 years of these sort of crimes and murders and assassinations and stealing of resources and political chaos.
Right.
All of the world is now coming to the summary judgment that the West, in particular the United States and Great Britain, are more murderous, thuggish cults rather than liberators of oppressed peoples and builders of healthy nations.
Okay, I need to take and ask you just to give us a few short sentences on something you said there, Scott Minute, which, if I heard you correctly, you said that even U.S. soldiers did not have mercy on U.S. soldiers who were getting in the way. Can you elaborate on that for us so we can have another program, perhaps, a full program to dedicate to that?
Pat Tillman was a special forces soldier that went in to the Rangers when he was a football player, and he was executed. And the body forensic analysis showed that he had been shot with a machine gun fire by a U.S. machine gun, not a Kalashnikov. I've talked to investigators and lawyers that were looking into that. Numerous other U.S. soldiers, such as myself, were imprisoned, were blackballed, were kicked out of the military, were reprimanded when we were exposing the CIA bringing briefcases of cash in Iraq and exposing that it was just being doled out.
Sure.
I know soldiers that were kicked out and in some cases executed because they get in the way of the military-industrial complex, and that's at the heart of this corruption and death. The soldiers are wrong to do the murdering, but what's even more wrong are the politicians and the senior officers that indoctrinate these young soldiers with this murderous agenda.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that. Back to the topic now, which maybe in a sense is indirectly related, but to our, not surprise, should I say, but to our shock, Vladimir Goldstein, there has been other indications that have happened on this scale, perhaps even bigger. One report indicating in 24, this is not a report, this is the Royal Military Police that launched an investigation back in 2014 in which there were 600 alleged offenses that were committed by the British forces in Afghanistan, which included some of the killings. Some of the killings included the SAS squadron. But then it says the RMP investigators told the BBC that they were obstructed by the British military. So that seems to me like it's a concerted effort to cover this up.
Yeah, this is an ugly story, and I want to return to what Scott mentioned, is that the whole war was ugly. And I think, you know, the soldiers, even a good soldier, something which once on the ground, it's kind of, you know, greedy and so on, they lose their morale. They probably start taking drugs. They got cynical and discouraged. And then they end up, you know, committing, you know, murders, blatant murders, totally kind of cynical murders. And then it ends up being covered up. It's not like, you know, Brits were fighting for their independence from Hitler's bombing or something. They were in the wrong country where they didn't know what they're fighting for. And I think that's an inevitable result. And we see it's happening here and there. But what is interesting, it's all accompanied by absolute barrage of lies, because it's all only the other side commits crimes. We remember how they, you know, when, the first, war against Iraq, you know, in defense of Kuwait started. They came up with this stupid idea of like Iraqi forces rape babies, take them from incubators, all just only they do all this crime. But our forces, and then our forces come over there and destroy cities, kill half a million, soldiers. So that type of propaganda is really, really unpleasant. And until the consumers of the news continue to buy into this simplistic bipolar world where the enemies of Anglo-Saxon empires are all evil and vicious and pull babies out of incubators, while we British soldiers are just squeaky clean, and that lies will continue and the wars will continue.
Well, Scott,
and let me just add, the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter was the woman who appeared to the Congress and made those lies about babies being thrown out of incubators. That was the Central Intelligence of the United States engineering a lie to speak to the American Congress through the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, and the British were fully on board with that and were telling the same lies through Tony Blair and their own cabinet ministers. So this is a perfect example of your other guest identified, dating all the way back to the 1990-1991 First Gulf War, and it has only gotten progressively worse as the West has progressively degenerated into an almost subhuman military-industrial conquest juggernaut of destruction that hopefully the world is finally ostracizing and rejecting. And I think they're looking at Russia as a replacement because of the more moral and intelligent character and expressions, as well as Iran, that's coming out from a new emerging world order that pulls us away from the old world order, which for 20 years has been built on the bones and the blood and the fire and the destruction of lives and systems of government and civilization.
Well, I would think along those lines, Scott Bennett, as you just mentioned, and you did mention before, that this, in a sense, presents itself an opportunity in order for these crimes to be exposed. Of course, it's so sad that Afghanistan was the ground of which, maybe according to a playbook shared by both the UK and U.S. operatives, that they did and commit these types of crimes. And to parallel that or compare that to what's going on in Ukraine, where it's no secret, I'm sure you know, that the U.S. has said we will fight the Russians until the last Ukrainian standing. But in this case, are we seeing any light in terms of more exposure of what's happening? I mean, well, Press TV does that, but I mean, it should be on a more massive scale, so the world is, aware that this is going on.
That's the problem. The world isn't aware it's going on because the British media and the United States media have all conspired to do nothing but advance the political agenda and speaking points of the government power. Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, Victoria Nuland, all of these people were instrumental in the original conquest of Ukraine, the coup d'etat, the overthrowing of Yanukovych, the planting of the chemical bioweapons labs, which are now being linked to COVID-19, which came out of Wuhan, but before it went to Fort Detrick, and before Detrick, it was linked to the bioweapons labs in Ukraine. So the United States is responsible, I would say, for the COVID-19 biological development. But the world is waking up and seeing the fraud and hypocrisy that is being manifested by the West.
Let me give Vladimir Goldstein the final question here. I'm almost at a loss to ask this question because it sounds like I shouldn't even bother. But under UK law, from what I'm reading, governing the armed forces, it's a criminal offense for a commanding officer to fail to inform the military police if they become aware of potential war crimes. It sounds like they did commit war crimes intentionally, but of course there's a law out there. Why then not act on this law now that some of these exposures have happened? In less than a minute, please.
Well, the army, like any other institution, try to protect their own. Remember, like a very courageous lieutenant in the American army, which tried to stop this My Lai massacre. I think he was actually charged. The person who was supposed to stop it was charged. So I don't have high hopes about Great Britain. They might accuse someone just to slap on the wrist, but their lies and their kind of we are better than that will continue, and propaganda will definitely continue, as we see example from Ukraine. That this is the same thing which was done in Kuwait, but even on a greater scale.
Thank you so much for that, Vladimir Goldstein, Associate Professor of Slavic Studies, Brown University. Scott Bennett, thank you, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer from San Francisco. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikhail Vitagwe and the team, this is goodbye.